If you are ready to step into the person you've always known you could be, I built the Second Life to give you a complete roadmap grounded in timeless principles of success, so you can finally transform for real and start building greater wealth, stronger health, deeper relationships, lasting peace, and a life that truly mirrors your potential. Click the first link in the description and begin becoming who you were always meant to be. There arrives a moment when you stop saying, "I'm just worn out," and start sensing something heavier, something you struggle to put into words. It isn't physical tiredness. It's a hollow stillness that settles deep in your chest, as though a part of you has been holding the weight of everything for far too long without a single moment of release. You still get up, you still move through your days, you still handle what needs handling. But something has quietly shifted. Conversations feel hollow, drive feels manufactured. Even the still handle what needs handling. But something has quietly shifted. Conversations feel hollow, drive feels manufactured. Even the things that once lit you up no longer carry the same spark. And that change is impossible to ignore. At first, you try to dismiss it. You tell yourself it's temporary, just pressure, just a difficult stretch of time. But somewhere beneath that, you know it's more, because this feeling doesn't lift when you sleep. It follows you into every quiet corner of your life. And the most painful part is that you can't trace it to a single cause. There's no And the most painful part is that you can't trace it to a single cause. There's no obvious moment to point to, no clear breaking point. It's as if something shifted gradually, slowly, until one morning you woke up and no longer recognized yourself. Perhaps it was the relentless pressure, the demands placed on you, the moments you had to hold it together when you were crumbling inside, the times you kept moving when every part of you wanted to stop. Those moments don't vanish. They accumulate in silence until something deep within you begins to fracture. You start seeing it in subtle ways. Your patience thins. Your thoughts grow heavier. You begin questioning things you once accepted without hesitation. And quietly, without noticing, you turn that weight on yourself, wondering if you are the problem. That's where it becomes truly dangerous. Not because you are broken, but because you begin to believe you are. And once that belief takes root, everything you experience seems to confirm it. Every stumble feels enormous. Every mistake feels deeply personal. But what if this isn't brokenness at all? What if this is a transformation that simply doesn't look like one? What if you've arrived at a place where the version of you that brought you here can no longer carry you forward, and something new is pressing to be born? Because there is a point in every person's evolution where the familiar stops making sense forward, and something new is pressing to be born. Because there is a point in every person's evolution where the familiar stops making sense, where the old ways of coping crumble, where pushing harder only deepens the disconnection. And in that place, it's natural to assume something is broken. Most people flee it. They fill the silence with noise, distraction, or desperate solutions. But what if this moment isn't meant to be solved quickly? What if it's meant to be sat with, slowly, honestly, without forcing a resolution? There is still something alive in you, even now when it feels faint. You wouldn't be seeking clarity if the flame had gone out entirely. You wouldn't be listening, reflecting, searching. That means something within you is still reaching, and that part of you carries more power than you realize. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it is constant. It is the part of you that hasn't surrendered even when everything feels unstable. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, but it is constant. It is the part of you that hasn't surrendered even when everything feels unstable. And if you learn to acknowledge it, you'll understand it never truly left. Because being in this place doesn't mean you've lost yourself. It means you've outgrown a version of yourself. It means you're standing in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. And that space is always uncomfortable. You don't need to have everything figured out in this moment. You don't need to perform strength at every turn. What matters is that you don't rush to label this feeling. Because the moment you call it an ending, to label this feeling. Because the moment you call it an ending, you stop looking for what it might become. So pause. Let yourself sit with what you're carrying without judging it immediately. There is something beneath the surface here that hasn't fully shown itself yet. And if you remain present with it, it may begin to reveal something you didn't expect. Because what feels like collapse is often the beginning of a deeper reorganization, something you couldn't reach before, something that asks you to release what no longer works, even when the unfamiliarity feels unsettling. And if you can hold steady just a little longer, if you can resist the urge to give this feeling a final name, you may begin to see that this isn't the end of your strength. It's the moment. You may begin to see that this isn't the end of your strength. It's the moment your strength begins to take an entirely new shape. There comes a period in the life of every person when the familiar rhythms of thought and behavior begin to lose their hold. Not because the individual has failed, but because he has quietly reached the boundary of what his current understanding can sustain. In this period, a man may carry on with his daily routines, yet feel as though something within him has quietly withdrawn its former certainty, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar stillness. This condition is often mistaken for weakness, for the world has taught men to associate strength with constant movement, constant certainty, and constant enthusiasm. Yet there exists a deeper form of strength that does not announce itself with noise, but instead begins its quiet work beneath the surface of awareness. It is in this silent turning that the conditions for a greater life are being laid. The exhaustion that accompanies this state is not of the body, for the body may recover with rest. That the conditions for a greater life are being laid. The exhaustion that accompanies this state is not of the body, for the body may recover with rest. It is the exhaustion of carrying thoughts, expectations, and burdens that no longer align with the deeper desires of the person. It is the weariness of maintaining a version of oneself that has already served its purpose yet continues to be held in place by habit and necessity. Many who move through this stage attempt to outrun it through busyness, believing that enough activity will restore their former sense of clarity. They immerse themselves in work, in conversation, in external pursuits, hoping to move faster than the feeling pursuing them. Yet the harder they run, the more persistent it becomes, for it is not something that can be outpaced. It is something that must be understood. It is essential to comes, for it is not something that can be outpaced. It is something that must be understood. It is essential to recognize that no man begins to feel estranged from his former self until he has first outgrown the conditions that once defined him. The very discomfort he experiences is evidence that something within him is pushing toward expansion. What he perceives as loss is often the first signal that a greater capacity is attempting to surface. Consider the individual who has long operated under pressure, fulfilling obligations, meeting expectations, and holding firm in moments when rest was what he truly needed. Each of these moments leaves an impression on the mind. Though small in isolation, their accumulation forms a weight carried silently, without recognition, until it begins to reshape the very structure of thought itself. As this weight builds, the mind begins to alter its rhythm. Thoughts that once arrived easily now require effort. Motivations that once felt genuine now feel manufactured. Even simple engagement with others may begin to feel distant, as though the individual is present in body but absent in spirit. This is not because his capability has diminished, but because the mind is in the process of reorganizing itself. At this stage, many make the critical mistake of turning their attention inward with judgment rather than curiosity. They begin to question their value, their capacity, and their worth, assuming that the change they feel must reflect some personal failing. This misreading is one of the greatest dangers a man may face, for it leads him to construct conclusions on incomplete ground. In truth, the mind is never idle. It is always moving, always responding to what it receives and what it entertains. When the demands of life exceed what the current structure of the mind can support, the mind does not shatter. It begins to adapt. This mind does not shatter. It begins to adapt. This adaptation, however, does not always present itself in a way that is immediately clear. There is a law of growth which holds that before any new structure may be formed, the old must first loosen its grip. This loosening often resembles instability. It may feel like uncertainty, like confusion, like the loss of a compass. Yet these sensations are not signs of failure. They are signs that the mind is preparing to reorganize itself at a higher level. History offers countless examples of individuals who have passed through such seasons. Andrew Carnegie himself endured periods of profound dissatisfaction before discovering the principles that would later define his legacy. He did not interpret those moments as proof of inadequacy, but as signals that he had not yet aligned himself with his true direction. The difference between those who rise from such periods and those who remain caught within them lies not in the absence of discomfort, but in how it is read. The one who sees discomfort as an enemy will resist it and extend his suffering. The one who sees it as a messenger will begin to listen, and in listening will discover the direction he must move. It is also during this stage that the individual may begin to notice shifts in how others perceive him. Though he may feel uncertain within, there is often a quiet strength beginning to emerge, one that is not rooted in visible confidence, but may sense this change even if they cannot name it, and may begin to hold him in a different kind of regard. This regard does not come from visible achievement, but from the unseen work unfolding within. It is the recognition of a man who continues to stand even when the ground beneath him feels uncertain. Acknowledgement of a presence no longer driven purely by externals, but beginning to be guided by something deeper. In such moments, it becomes essential for the individual to resist assigning a final meaning to his condition. The mind has a natural tendency to seek closure, to label experiences quickly in order to claim a sense of control. Yet premature conclusions often lead to unnecessary irritation. To declare oneself broken is to halt the very process attempting to rebuild. Instead, one must adopt a posture of observation. He must learn to sit with his thoughts without immediately reacting to them. He must allow the feeling to exist without rushing to erase it. For it is within this space of observation that clarity begins to form, quietly, deliberately. There is something within every individual that remains untouched by confusion. It is not loud, nor does it demand attention, but it persists. It is the part of the mind that continues to seek understanding even when everything else feels uncertain. The very act of searching for clarity is evidence that this part is still active. It is this quiet persistence that must be recognized and protected, for it is not the absence of difficulty that defines strength, but the presence of continued movement in the face of it. A man may feel uncertain. He may feel disconnected. He may feel as though he has lost his way. Yet if he continues to seek, he has not lost himself. The greatest mistake at this stage is to define it too quickly. To call it an ending is to close the door on what it may yet become. To call it failure is to miss the transformation occurring beneath the surface. What appears as fracturing is often the rearrangement of forces that will later produce strength of a higher order. Therefore, let the individual pause. Let him resist the urge to press forward urgently or to retreat into what is familiar. Let him remain present with what he feels, without judgment, without haste. For within this state lies the beginning of something that cannot be reached through comfort alone. And let him affirm, not with forced conviction, but with quiet certainty, there is nothing within me that is broken. There is only something within me that is changing its form, preparing me for a greater expression of my life. There is a particular tendency of the human mind to reach for immediate explanations for conditions it does not yet understand. Conflict, his first impulse is not to observe it with patience, but to define it quickly. He reaches for the nearest conclusion, not because it is accurate, but because it offers a temporary sense of control over what feels unsteady. It is in this moment that many begin forming beliefs that shape the remainder of their experience. A passing condition becomes a permanent identity. A temporary disorientation is labeled as failure. A season of transition is mistaken for collapse. And once the mind accepts such interpretations, it begins gathering evidence to support them, reinforcing the very condition it is trying to escape. This is the subtle power of belief. The mind does not merely reflect reality, it participates in shaping it. Whatever a man tells himself consistently, whether true or not, begins to influence his perception, his behavior, and ultimately his outcomes. Thus, a single misinterpretation, if repeated with enough frequency, may that governs the whole of his life. Fear plays a significant role in this process. Not the fear that rises from immediate threat, but the quieter, more persistent kind that distorts judgment and magnifies uncertainty. This fear does not announce itself openly. It disguises itself as logic, as caution, as clear-eyed realism. It whispers to the individual that something is deeply wrong, that he has lost his way, that he is no longer capable of what he once achieved. Under the influence of such fear, the mind begins to narrow its field of vision. It turns away from possibility and locks onto limitation. It begins interpreting neutral events as confirmation of deeper inadequacy. In this state, even the absence of visible progress may feel like evidence of decline. Yet what the individual fails to see is that confusion is not the absence of direction. It is the presence of competing directions. It is the indication that old patterns no longer serve and new ones have not yet fully formed. It is the space between what was and what will be. And though it feels unsettled, it is rich with potential. Thomas Edison, whose name has become synonymous with invention and persistence, passed through countless moments that could easily have been read as failure. Had he chosen to measure his efforts by their immediate results, he would have abandoned his work long before any breakthrough arrived. Instead, he treated each unsuccessful attempt not as defeat, but as data, an adjustment that brought him closer to his aim. The difference lay not in his circumstances, but in his interpretation of them. Where others might have seen limitation, he saw information. Where others might have felt discouraged, he found direction. His power did not arise from the absence of difficulty, but from his refusal to assign it a negative meaning. This same principle applies to any individual who finds himself in a state of conflict. The thoughts that surface during such periods are not always reliable indicators. They are often reflections of temporary conditions shaped by fatigue, pressure, and uncertainty. To accept them without examination is to allow the mind to operate without leadership. Leadership of thought is among the greatest capacities a man may develop. It is the ability to observe one's own thinking without being consumed. It is the capacity to question conclusions, to examine beliefs, and to choose deliberately which ideas shall be allowed to take root. Without this capacity, the mind becomes a field in which any passing thought may grow unchecked. Negative impressions, if repeated, begin to dominate. Doubt, if entertained, begins to expand. And gradually, the individual may find himself living in a reality shaped more by fear than by fact. It is also during this stage that the individual may begin measuring himself against others, seeking reassurance through external comparison. He observes those who appear certain, who seem to move with ease, and he concludes that his own uncertainty signals inferiority. Yet such comparisons are rarely fair, for they are built on appearances rather than understanding. Every individual moves through periods of uncertainty, whether visible or concealed. The difference lies in how those periods are navigated. Some conceal their struggles behind an outward composure. The presence of uncertainty is not what defines a man. It is his response to it that determines his path. The mind, when left without direction, tends to move toward the most immediate and emotional interpretation. It does not naturally seek truth. It seeks resolution. And resolution, when pursued without patience, often leads to conclusions that are incomplete or incorrect. For this reason, it becomes essential for the individual to cultivate a different approach. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" he must learn to ask, "What is changing within me?" Instead of seeking to eliminate discomfort, he must seek to understand it, for understanding transforms what appears as a problem into a process. There is a profound difference between a man who reacts to his thoughts and a man who examines them. The former becomes subject to every fluctuation of the mind, while the latter gains authority over his inner world. This authority does not come from suppression, but from direction. When a man begins to direct his thoughts, he begins to reshape his experience. He no longer accepts every feeling as fact, nor every doubt as truth. He recognizes that his mind is capable of producing both constructive and destructive ideas, and he accepts responsibility for choosing which shall guide him. This is not accomplished in a single moment, nor through a single decision. It is the result of repeated effort, of returning again and again to a position of awareness. It demands patience, for the patterns of thought formed over time do not shift instantly. Yet with persistence, they may be redirected. As this redirection takes place, the individual begins to notice quiet changes. The weight of his thoughts grows lighter. The intensity of his doubts begins to ease. The sense of overwhelm gives way to a strengthens with each deliberate choice. Others may begin to observe this shift as well. Where once there was visible strain, there is now composed presence. Where there was hesitation, there is now measured movement. This change does not arise from external conditions, but from the internal decision to no longer be governed by misinterpretation. It is important to remember that the mind does not cease producing thoughts, nor does it eliminate all uncertainty. What changes is the individual's relationship to those thoughts. He becomes less reactive, more observant, and increasingly capable of maintaining direction regardless of internal fluctuation. This is the beginning of mental mastery. Not the elimination of difficulty, but the ability to navigate it without losing one's instruments, not commands. And that belief is a choice, not a consequence. Therefore, let the individual adopt a governing principle, one that shall guide him through moments of confusion. I refuse to interpret this moment as defeat. I understand that what I feel is temporary, and that within it lies the instruction I need for my next advancement. And in holding to this principle, he will find that what once appeared as a wall becomes an opening, and what once felt like an ending reveals itself as the beginning of a higher form of understanding. There comes a stage in the progress of every individual where the greatest obstacle he must overcome is found not in the external world, but within the structure of his own identity. This obstacle does not present itself as an obvious adversary. It appears instead as familiarity, habits of thought, patterns of behavior, and ways of seeing oneself that have long gone unquestioned. A man grows accustomed. He builds his decisions, his expectations, and even his limitations around this belief. Over time, this identity becomes so firmly established that it begins to feel permanent. Yet no identity is fixed. It is simply the result of repeated thoughts reinforced by experience and accepted without examination. When growth begins to stir, this identity is the first to feel its pressure. The thoughts that once aligned with it begin to lose their force. The actions that once felt instinctive begin to feel effortful. The individual may find himself resisting impulses that once guided him naturally, not because he has lost his ability, but because those impulses no longer serve the direction in which he is being drawn. This is the dissolution of former identity. Not a sudden collapse, but a gradual loosening. The beliefs that once felt certain begin to feel incomplete. The goals that once appeared desirable begin to yield. The methods that once produced results begin to yield less. This creates a sense of instability, for the ground upon which the individual has operated feels as solid as before. Many interpret this instability as danger. They attempt to restore the former identity, to return to the habits and patterns that once brought them certainty. They cling to the familiar even when it satisfies, for the unknown feels more threatening than the unsatisfying known. Yet this effort ultimately proves futile. For once the mind has seen the limitations of its former patterns, it cannot fully return to them. The awareness gained cannot be undone. The individual may attempt to resume his previous way of living, but he will find that it no longer fits as it once did. What was once comfortable now feels confining. What was once motivating now feels hollow. This is precisely the point at which many abandon their progress. They conclude that something has gone wrong, that they have lost their drive, their clarity, their sense of purpose. In truth, they have lost nothing of value. What they have lost is the illusion that their former identity was sufficient for their continued growth. Henry Ford, before becoming one of the most consequential figures in industrial history, faced repeated moments in which his ideas were dismissed, his methods questioned, and his direction misunderstood. Had he clung to the conventional thinking of his time, remained within the boundaries of what was already known. Instead, he allowed his former understanding to be challenged, and in doing so, he built something entirely new. This willingness to release the former identity is the mark of every individual who advances beyond the ordinary. There exists a law which governs all progress. No new structure may be built upon a foundation that refuses to shift. The old must give way, not because it was wrong, but because it has completed its purpose. To resist this law is to remain confined within the limits of one's past. The dissolution of identity is therefore not an act of destruction, but an act of preparation. It clears the space in which something greater may be formed. It removes the limitations that once it creates the conditions necessary for a new way of thinking, acting, and being to emerge. Yet, this process is not without discomfort. The mind accustomed to certainty resists the absence of it. It seeks to regain control, to reestablish familiar patterns, to restore what appears to have been lost. During this time, the individual may feel as though he is without stability, without a clear sense of who he is. This feeling is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the previous definition of self is no longer adequate. It is in this space, between the dissolution of the old and the formation of the new, that the individual must exercise the greatest degree of patience. He must resist the urge to define himself too quickly. He must allow the process to unfold without forcing it into a familiar shape. For it is only through this allowance that something truly new may emerge. Others may begin to notice a change during this stage. Though the individual himself may feel uncertain, there is often a quiet strength that becomes perceptible to those around him. Not the strength of confidence born from certainty, but the strength of endurance born from transition. There is a steadiness in one who continues forward without full clarity. There is a depth in one who is willing to question himself without collapsing under that questioning. This depth is often sensed by others, even when they cannot fully articulate it. They may begin to perceive in him a presence that is less reactive, less dependent on external approval, and more grounded in something still forming. This perception, though subtle, marks the beginning of a shift, but in how he is received by the world around him. It is also during this phase that the individual must learn the value of releasing attachment, not only to outcomes, but to his previous understanding of himself. He must recognize that growth requires space, and that space cannot exist where the old is held too tightly. To release does not mean to abandon. It means to acknowledge that something has fulfilled its role and is no longer needed in its present form. It is an act of recognition, not rejection. The man who masters this act gains access to a level of freedom that cannot be obtained through external means. He is no longer bound by the need to maintain a fixed identity. He becomes adaptable, capable of evolving in response to new understanding. This adaptability is one of the most powerful advantages a man may possess. It allows him to navigate change without losing direction. It enables him to grow without being confined by his past. Opportunities that remain invisible to those locked in fixed ways of thinking. Yet this mastery is not reached without effort. It requires the individual to remain conscious of his thoughts, to challenge his assumptions, and to resist the pull of familiarity when it no longer serves him. It demands that he trust the process of transformation even when the outcome is not yet visible. Above all, it requires that he adopt a new understanding of what it means to feel uncertain. Uncertainty is not the absence of identity. It is the presence of multiple possibilities. It is the indication that the individual is no longer confined to a single way of being, but is in the process of discovering a broader expression of himself. To embrace this uncertainty is to embrace growth. To resist it is to remain unchanged. Therefore, let the individual stand steady in this stage, not seeking immediate answers, but allowing them to emerge in their proper time. What he feels is not a signal to retreat, but an invitation to expand. And let him affirm with quiet conviction, I release the version of myself that has completed its purpose. I do not resist the change moving through me, for I understand that it is preparing me for a greater expression of my life. After the former identity has loosened its hold and the mind has passed through the uncertain interval between what was and what will be, there begins a process that is less visible, yet far more decisive in its effect. This is the stage in which the mind, having been relieved of its previous constraints, begins to reorganize itself according to a higher pattern. This reorganization does not occur through force. It cannot be rushed nor commanded into existence through desire alone. It unfolds according to a natural law, one that governs all growth, whether of the mind, the body, or the circumstances of a life. That law is this: when space has been created, something new will seek to fill it. The individual who has to dissolve has, without fully realizing it, created exactly such space. Into this space, new thoughts begin to arrive, ideas that were previously inaccessible, perceptions once obscured, and impulses that now feel more aligned with something deeper and more enduring. At first, these new impressions may appear faint. They do not arrive with the same force the old habits once carried. They are quieter, more deliberate, and often require attention in order to be recognized. Yet within them lies a power that far exceeds the noise of former patterns. It is in this stage that the individual must learn the value of stillness. For it is in stillness that the mind becomes, when the constant motion of force thinking is reduced, the mind begins to operate with greater precision. Thoughts no longer arise from reaction, but from reflection. Ideas no longer scatter, but begin to take shape in a more organized, purposeful way. This is the beginning of true mental direction. The man who reaches this stage age and recognizes its significance gains an advantage that few possess. He begins to understand that his thoughts are not merely responses to external conditions, but instruments through which he may shape those conditions. He moves from being influenced by his environment to influencing it. Yet this shift requires discipline. The new thoughts that emerge must be nurtured, repeated, examined, and strengthened through deliberate attention. For while the old patterns have weakened, they have not disappeared entirely. They remain, waiting to reassert themselves should the new structure fail to take firm hold. Herein lies the importance of repetition. It is not enough for a man to encounter a new idea once and expect it to reshape his life by what it experiences repeatedly. Just as the former identity was constructed through repetition, the new identity must be built through the same process. Yet, repetition must not be confused with monotony. When applied with understanding, repetition becomes a means of reinforcement, not of dullness. Each time a constructive thought is entertained, it gains strength. Each time it is acted upon, it becomes more firmly embedded. And over time, what once required effort begins to occur naturally. Napoleon Hill himself, in his own journey, found that the principles of success could not be applied once and then forgotten. They required continuous engagement. Each repetition brought greater clarity, deeper understanding, and more consistent results. It was through this persistent application that his philosophy became not merely a theory, but a lived reality. As the mind reorganizes, another change begins to unfold. Emotional energy, once scattered and often directed toward unproductive ends, becomes more focused. The individual finds he is no longer as easily disturbed by minor inconveniences. His reactions grow measured. His responses become intentional. He begins to conserve his energy, directing it toward what truly matters. This conservation flows. A scattered mind produces scattered results. A focused mind produces concentrated power. This power, though quiet at first, begins to manifest in observable ways. Others may begin to notice a difference. There is a calmness where once there was restlessness. There is clarity where once there was confusion, a sense of purpose, even if it has not yet been defined. This presence does not demand attention, yet it draws it. People are naturally drawn to those who exhibit command over their own. They sense stability. They perceive confidence, not as a performance, but as a state of being. And in this perception, they begin to extend trust. This trust becomes a form of influence. Without speaking a word, the individual begins to affect those around him. His composure shapes their reactions. His clarity influences their thinking. His direction shapes their sense of what is possible. This is the early formation of what may later become leadership, not the kind that is imposed, but the kind that is recognized. It is important, however, that the individual does not become distracted by these outward reflections. For the work of reorganization is not yet complete. There remains a need for continued attention, continued discipline, and continued refinement of thought. The mind, though reorganizing, must be guided. It must be directed toward ideas that align with growth, with purpose, and with constructive action. It must be protected from influences that would disturb its emerging order. For while the individual has gained strength, he is not entertains, the influences he allows, and the environments in which he places himself all contribute to the structure of his mind. By choosing these deliberately, he reinforces the new order. By neglecting them, he risks allowing disorder to return. This is not a matter of isolation, but of intention. The individual need not withdraw from the world, but he must engage with it deliberately. He must become aware. As this awareness deepens, so too does his capacity for self-direction. He begins to recognize patterns within his own thinking. He sees how certain thoughts lead to certain feelings and how those feelings shape his actions. With this recognition comes the ability to intervene, to redirect, adjust, and refine. This is the foundation of mastery. Not mastery over others, but mastery over oneself. And it is from this mastery that all lasting external success is ultimately drawn. For no man may sustain real success without first establishing order within his own mind. External achievements not supported by internal structure are temporary. They cannot be maintained, for they lack the foundation required to hold them. But when the mind is organized, when thought is directed and energy is focused, the individual becomes capable of producing results that are both consistent and enduring. He is no longer dependent on circumstance. He is no longer subject to every fluctuation. This force, though developed quietly, is unmistakable. It is the presence of a man who has begun to understand himself, who has begun to direct his thinking, and who has begun to shape his life from within outward. And as this process continues, the next stage is to reveal itself, not through sudden revelation, but through gradual clarity. For when the mind has been reorganized, capable of perceiving something it could not see before. Direction, purpose, a definite aim. But before this aim is fully formed, the individual must steady within the process, trusting that what is being built within him is not accidental, but the result as certain as any other. Therefore, let him continue, without haste, without doubt, and without the need for immediate answers. And let him affirm with calm assurance, my mind is organizing itself into a higher order. I do not rush this process, for I understand that in its completion lies the foundation of my future strength. When the mind has passed through confusion, released its former identity, and begun to reorganize itself into a higher order, there comes a moment, quiet, often unexpected, when direction begins to reveal itself. It does not arrive as a sudden command or a loud declaration. It emerges gradually, like light at the first edge of dawn, subtle at first, yet unmistakable once it is recognized. This is the awakening of definiteness of purpose. It is important to understand that purpose is not something forced into existence through effort alone. Many seek it through strain, believing that if they think long enough, analyze deeply enough, or search widely enough, a clear answer will eventually surface. Yet, when the mind is scattered, purpose remains hidden. When the mind is burdened by conflicting thoughts, purpose cannot take form. But when the mind becomes organized, when thought is directed and energy is conserved, purpose begins to surface naturally, as though it had been present all along, waiting only for the proper conditions to be seen. This sense of purpose may not appear as a complete picture. It may present itself as a leaning inclination, a quiet pull toward a particular direction. The individual may feel drawn toward certain ideas, certain pursuits, or certain modes of expression that were not before. These inclinations must not be dismissed, for they are the early signals of a development taking place within the mind. They are the natural consequence of a mind that has begun in greater harmony with itself. Many, however, make the mistake of dismissing these early signals because they do not appear fully formed. They wait for absolute certainty before acting, believing that purpose must be entirely clear before it can be followed. Yet such certainty rarely arrives in advance. It is revealed through movement, not before it. The man who waits for completely, the man who acts upon the clarity he already possesses, however partial, begins to develop it further. Each step taken in alignment with this emerging direction strengthens it. Each action provides new information, new experience, and new understanding. In this way, purpose grows clearer through participation. This is the distinction between those who discover their purpose and those who remain in search of it. Discovery does not occur through passive reflection alone. It occurs through active engagement. The individual must be willing to move, to experiment, to follow the direction that feels most aligned, even if it is not yet fully defined. There is also a distinction between external goals and internal purpose that must be clearly understood. External goals that others expect by what society values, by what is desirable. Internal purpose, however, arises from within. It is not imposed. It is recognized. A man may pursue many goals and still feel unfulfilled, for those goals may not be aligned with his deeper nature. But when he begins to act in accordance with his purpose, even small actions carry a sense of meaning that no achievement alone can replicate. This sense of meaning restores energy. Where there was once fatigue, there is now a quiet momentum. Where there was once hesitation, there is now a willingness to act. The individual feels as though he must force himself forward. Instead, he finds himself drawn forward, guided by something that feels both natural and necessary. This is one of the clearest signs that purpose is beginning to take hold. The energy that accompanies it is not frantic nor overwhelming. It is steady, it is self-sustaining, for it is not dependent upon external validation. It is rooted in alignment. As this alignment deepens, the individual begins to make decisions with greater ease. Indecision, which once consumed time and energy, begins to diminish. The question is no longer, what should I do, but rather, does this align with my direction? And with this question comes clarity. Actions that align are pursued. Those that do not are released without unnecessary struggle. This simplicity is a form of power. For the man who knows his direction does not waste energy on what is irrelevant. He does not attempt to be everything at once. It is at this stage that others begin to observe a more noticeable shift. Where once there was uncertainty, there is now direction. Where once there was inconsistency, there is now steadiness. The individual may not yet have achieved visible results, but there is a certainty in his movement that commands attention. People are drawn to direction. They recognize it even while it is still forming. They sense that the individual is no longer drifting, but moving with intention. This perception builds a form of influence. For others are naturally inclined to trust those who appear to know where they are going. This trust, once established, opens doors. Opportunities begin to present themselves, not by chance, but as a response to the clarity that has been developed. The individual, now aligned with his purpose, begins to recognize these opportunities where previously accidental. It is the result of a mind that has become tuned to its direction. Just as a man focused upon a particular aim becomes more aware of it, so too does the individual aligned with his begin to notice pathways that were once invisible. Yet even in this stage, care must be taken. Purpose, though powerful, must be maintained through consistency. It is not enough to recognize it once. It must be reaffirmed through repetition. It must be strengthened through persistence. For without continued engagement, it may lose its clarity and fade back into obscurity. This is why repetition remains essential, not as a means of forcing belief, but as a means of reinforcing alignment. Each time the individual acts in accordance with his purpose, he deepens his connection to it. Each time he reaffirms it in thought, he strengthens its presence within his mind. Over time, what began as an inclination becomes a definite aim. It becomes something expressed, pursued, and developed with intention. It becomes the central organizing principle of the individual's life, guiding his actions, shaping his decisions, and influencing his results. This is the point at which purpose transforms from a feeling into a direction. And once this transformation occurs, the individual is no longer wandering. He is no longer searching without aim. He is moving deliberately and steadily towards something he both understands and believes in. This belief is not blind. It is grounded in experience. It is supported by the internal changes that have taken place. It is reinforced by the results that begin to appear, however small at first. And as this belief grows, so too does the individual's confidence. Not the loud outward display, but the quiet assurance that comes from knowing one's direction. It is a confidence that does not require validation, for it is rooted in alignment rather than appearance. Therefore, let the individual continue to move in accordance with this emerging purpose. Let him trust the direction that reveals yet fully visible. For it is not necessary to see the entire path in order to walk it. It is only necessary to see the next step and to take it. And let him affirm with calm certainty, I am guided by a definite purpose that grows clearer with each step I take. I do not wait for certainty to act, for I know that clarity is revealed through movement. When a man has passed through confusion, released the weight of his former identity, disciplined his thoughts, and aligned himself with a definite purpose, there comes a realization both simple and profound. He begins to see that the strength he once believed he had lost was never truly gone. It had merely changed its form. In the earlier stages of life, strength often appears as force. It expresses itself through urgency, through constant motion, through the need to prove, to push, and to endure against resistance. This form of strength is useful, for it carries a man through his initial struggles, yet it is not, for there exists a greater strength, one not driven by pressure, but by alignment. This strength does not require the individual to force himself into action. It does not depend upon external motivation or emotion. It arises naturally as a result of the harmony established within the mind. It is steady, composed, and enduring. The individual who reaches this stage begins to notice a change in how he meets life. Where he once reacted quickly, he now responds with consideration. Where he once felt overwhelmed by circumstances, he now observes them with clarity. Challenges no longer appear as threats, but as conditions to be understood and directed. This shift is not the result of circumstances changing, but of perception evolving. The same situations that once produced doubt now produce insight. The same obstacles that once created resistance now reveal opportunity. The individual has not removed difficulty from his life. He has changed his relationship to it. This is the essence of resilience. True resilience is not the ability to avoid struggle, but the ability to remain composed within it. It is the capacity to endure without losing direction, to continue without becoming discouraged, and to adapt without abandoning one's purpose. Such resilience cannot be developed in comfort alone. It is forged through the very experiences that once created uncertainty. Every moment of doubt, every period of confusion, every instance in which the individual chose to continue despite discomfort, all of it has contributed to the formation of this new strength. Nothing has been wasted. What once felt like fragmentation has become foundation. As this understanding deepens, the individual begins to experience a form of momentum entirely different from what he once knew. It is no longer the forced momentum of obligation, but the natural momentum of alignment. Actions flow more easily. Decisions require less strain. Progress, though still requiring effort, feels more consistent. This consistency is the mark of maturity. It is the indication that the individual is no longer dependent upon fluctuating emotion to guide his actions. He does not wait to feel ready. He does not require perfect conditions. He acts because he is directed, and in acting, he maintains his direction. Others begin to recognize this change more clearly. Where once there may have been visible struggle, there is now quiet certainty. Where once there was inconsistency, there is now reliability. The individual becomes someone upon whom others may depend, not because he claims strength, but because he demonstrates it through his presence. This presence carries weight. It influences without effort. It commands respect without demand. It creates an impression of stability that others find reassuring, particularly in times of uncertainty. Such influence is not accidental. It is the natural result of a mind that has become ordered, a purpose that has become clear, and a character that has been shaped through experience. It is the outward expression of inner mastery. At this stage, the individual also begins to see his past differently. What once appeared as periods of struggle now reveal themselves as necessary steps. The moments he once wished to avoid are now understood as essential to his development. He no longer resents them. He values them. This shift in perspective is one of the most powerful signs of transformation, for it indicates that the individual is no longer defined by his past, but informed by it. He carries forward the lessons, not the limitations. He uses the lessons, not the limitations. He uses his experiences as instruments, not as burdens. There is also a noticeable change in how he approaches challenges ahead. He no longer anticipates them with apprehension, nor does he attempt to avoid them. He understands that each challenge contains within it the potential for further growth. He meets them with readiness, not resistance. This readiness is a form of confidence, though it does not resemble the kind that seeks recognition. It is quiet. It is internal. It is based not on the expectation of success, but on the knowledge that he possesses the capacity to respond effectively regardless of outcome. This is what makes it unshakable, for it is not dependent upon circumstances, results, or approval. Dependent upon circumstances, results, or approval. It is rooted in self-mastery, and as such it remains stable even when external conditions fluctuate. The individual who reaches this level of strength is no longer easily swayed by the opinions of others. He listens, but he does not surrender his direction. He considers, but he does not abandon his purpose. He remains open, yet grounded. This balance is rare, and it is powerful. It allows him to continue growing without becoming unstable. It enables him to adapt without losing himself. It positions him to lead, not by force, but by example. And yet, even at this stage, the process does not end. Growth is not a destination, but a continuous unfolding. The strength that has been developed must be maintained through continued discipline. The purpose that has been discovered must be reinforced through continued action. The mind that has been organized must be guided through continued awareness. There is no final point at which effort is no longer required. But there is a point at which effort becomes natural. The individual no longer struggles against himself. He works with himself. His thoughts, his actions, and his purpose move in harmony. And in this harmony, he finds a level of effectiveness that was previously beyond reach. This is the return of strength, not as it once was, but as something far greater. Not loud, but steady. Not forced, but directed. Not temporary, but enduring. And as the individual stands in this new form of strength, he may look back upon the moment when he first felt broken and see it not as an end, but as the beginning of everything that followed. Therefore, let him stand firm in what he has become. Let him continue to act in alignment with his purpose. Let him maintain the discipline that has carried him this far, and let him affirm with unwavering certainty, my strength has not diminished, it has matured. I stand now with a power that is steady, directed, and beyond the reach of doubt. When a man has come through the stages of uncertainty, released the limitations of his former identity, disciplined his thoughts, aligned himself with a definite purpose, and developed a strength that is steady and enduring, he arrives at a realization that alters his entire understanding of life. He begins to see that the outer world, with all its conditions and circumstances, is not the true source of his experience. It is the reflection of something deeper, something within. He comes to understand that the real seat of power lies not in events, but in the interpretation of those events. This is the beginning of mastery. Not mastery over others nor over external conditions, but mastery over the inner world from which all external conditions are ultimately influenced. It is the recognition that thought is not passive but active, not merely responsive but creative. The man who understands this principle no longer sees himself as subject to life. He sees himself as a participant in its formation. Where once he reacted without awareness, he now observes before he responds. He recognizes that between every experience and every reaction, there exists a space, and within that moment lies his power. This power is subtle, yet profound. It does not announce itself with force, nor does it demand attention. It reveals itself through consistency, through the repeated act of choosing thoughts that align with purpose rather than those arising from fear, through the deliberate decision to maintain direction even when conditions shift. At this stage, the individual is no longer controlled by the immediate impressions of the moment. He is able to observe his thoughts without becoming defined by them. He may experience doubt, yet he is not ruled by it. He may encounter fear, yet he is not directed by it. He understands that thoughts are transient and that his role is not to eliminate them, but to choose which shall guide him. This distinction is the foundation of mental sovereignty. It allows the individual to remain stable in the presence of instability. It enables him to act with clarity in the midst of confusion. It gives him the ability to maintain his course regardless of the... Such a man becomes, in the truest sense, self-governed. He no longer depends upon external validation to determine his worth. He no longer requires favorable conditions in order to. He becomes independent of the forces that once influenced him, not by withdrawing from them, but by mastering his response to them. This mastery extends beyond thought into emotion. The individual begins to recognize that emotion, like thoughts, are not fixed states, but responses that can be guided through direct. He learns that by shifting his focus, by altering his interpretation, he can change the emotional quality of his experience. He does not deny emotion, nor does he suppress it. He understands it, and in understanding it, he gains the ability to guide it. This guidance allows him to remain composed in situations that would once have unsettled him. It enables him to maintain confidence in the face of uncertainty. It gives him the capacity to endure without becoming discouraged. This composure is not coldness, nor is it detachment. It is balance. It is the result of a mind that has learned to operate with intention rather than reaction. The expression of a man who has become aligned within himself and who therefore remains steady without. Others will observe this and be moved by it. They will see in him a calm that does not waver easily. They will notice a certainty that does not require justification. They will sense a presence that suggests control over them, but over himself. This presence inspires confidence. It creates trust. It establishes influence. And yet the individual doesn't seek these effects. They arise naturally as a result of his inner state, for it is a law that cannot be avoided. The inner condition of a man will express itself outwardly. There comes a moment when you stop saying, "I'm just tired," and start feeling something deeper that you can't easily name. It's not physical exhaustion. It's a hollow stillness that settles in your chest, like something inside you has been carrying too much for too long without relief. You still wake up. You still move. You still handle what needs handling. But something feels different now. Conversations feel hollow. Motivation feels manufactured. Even the things that once lit you up don't land the same way anymore. And that shift is hard to ignore. At first, you try to dismiss it. You tell yourself it's just a phase, just pressure, just a difficult stretch of days, but somewhere beneath that, you know it's more. Because this feeling doesn't lift when you rest. It follows you quietly into every moment. And the hardest part is that you can't trace it to one clear cause. There's no single event to point to, is that no obvious turning point. It's as if something shifted gradually, piece by piece, until one day you woke up and no longer recognized yourself. Maybe it was the relentless pressure, the expectations, the times you had to hold it together when you were crumbling inside, the times you kept moving when every part of you wanted to stop. Those moments don't vanish. They accumulate in silence until something deep within you begins to fracture. You start seeing it in small ways. Your patience thins. Your thoughts grow heavier. You begin questioning things you once accepted without hesitation. And slowly, without noticing, you turn that weight on yourself, wondering if you are the problem. That's where it becomes dangerous. Not because you're actually broken, but because you begin to believe you are. And once that belief takes root, everything you feel seems to confirm it. Every stumble feels enormous. Every mistake feels deeply personal. But what if this isn't brokenness? It simply doesn't look like one. What if you've arrived at a place where the version of you that brought you here can no longer carry you forward, and something new is pressing to be born? Because there is a point in every person's growth where the familiar stops making sense, where the old ways of coping crumble, where pushing harder only deepens the disconnection. And in that place, it's natural to assume something is wrong. Most people flee it. They fill the silence with noise, distraction, or desperate fixes. But what if this moment isn't meant to be solved quickly? What if it's meant to be sat with, slowly, honestly, without forcing an immediate answer? There is still something alive in you, even now when it feels faint. You wouldn't be searching for clarity if the flame had gone out entirely. You wouldn't be listening, reflecting, searching. That means something within you is still reaching. And that part of you carries more power than you realize. It's constant. It is the part that hasn't surrendered, even when everything feels uncertain. And if you learn to acknowledge it, you'll understand it. You'll understand it never truly left. Because being in this place doesn't mean you've lost yourself. It means you've outgrown a version of yourself. It means you're standing in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. And that space is always uncomfortable. If you are ready to step into the person you've always known you could be, I built the second life to give you a complete roadmap grounded in so you can finally transform for real and start building greater wealth, stronger health, deeper relationships, lasting inner peace, and a life that truly mirrors your potential. Click the first link in the description and begin becoming who you were always meant to be.